everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled The Evolving Therapeutic Potential and Regulation of CBD. This webinar is a part of the 5th Annual 2022 Cannabis Sciences virtual event. I am Antonina Salcido of LabRoots, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Today's educational web seminar is presented by LabRoots. Now let's get started. Before we begin, I'd just like to remind everyone that this event is interactive, and we encourage you to first participate by communicating with other attendees using our new live chat feature during the presentation. You can find that live chat located at the right of your screen. You can also participate by submitting as many questions as you would like during the presentation. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box and click Send. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. If you have trouble seeing or hearing the presentation, click on the Help Desk button located at the bottom of your screen within the navigation bar or from the lobby. Finally, as a reminder, this presentation is educational and offers free continuing education credits. Click on the Continuing Education Credits link located in the Abstract window below the presentation window and follow the process to obtain your credits. I now present today's speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Chen, CEO and co-founder of Radicle Science. For a complete biography on our speaker, please visit the Biography tab at the left of your screen. Dr. Chen, you may now begin your presentation.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. A lot of stuff we're going to cover today, and I'll leave plenty of time at the end for Q&A. A bit about myself. I'm trained as a physician, but I've always been more on the business and entrepreneurial side of things. After medical school, I actually started UCLA's Cannabis research program and ran that for a number of years, and left that about a year and a half ago to start Radicle Science. And we run clinical trials for health and wellness products. And we do them at a tremendous improvement in cost and speed. So diving into the agenda today. So first we'll talk about therapeutic potential of CBD, mainly focusing on what we have from human clinical trial data, but also touch briefly on what the animal data shows, but with a strong caveat there. We'll talk about the regulatory landscape of what's happening with CBD, some of the things that the FDA is finding when they do these tests of CBD products. And lastly, we'll talk about some of the preliminary results from the ACES study, which was the largest CBD trial ever done in history. And we'll see some of the interesting kind of signals that are bubbling up from that. So very briefly on this slide, I just wanted to, interesting. Oh, there we go. So just very briefly, cannabis has well over 100 cannabinoids. THC, CBD, they tend to be the most abundant in the strains that are grown today. And we have the most knowledge of them. They've been the most well studied. And very briefly, THC is the primary intoxicating ingredient in cannabis. CBD is non-intoxicating. Notice I didn't use the word psychoactive because CBD does impact the central nervous system. So it is psychoactive. It's just not intoxicating. THC has addictive properties and dependent properties. CBD does not. And in fact, CBD might even have some, anti-addictive properties. THC can cause motor impairments, worried about stone driving. CBD does no such thing. And THC can give you the munchies. CBD has no increase in appetite effects. So even though they're both cannabinoids, very different effects they present. And in terms of mechanism of action, THC has binding affinity at our cannabinoid receptors, which are part of our endocannabinoid system. You can Google more about that. CBD, on the other hand, doesn't seem to have much of an effect at the cannabinoid receptors in our body. They work through other receptors, PPAR receptors, serotonin receptors, and also they seem to maybe boost your levels of endocannabinoids, so the cannabinoids that your body naturally produces. But there's still a lot we don't know about how CBD actually impacts our bodies. Now, if we're looking at human clinical trial data on CBD, you can break down things into what we know a lot of, what we know a little bit about, and what we know pretty much nothing about. And so starting with, this is a sequence, that's interesting. Hold on. There we go. So starting with what we know a lot about, we have a lot of rigorous clinical trial data on the benefits of CBD for epilepsy, in particular, these pediatric forms of epilepsy. In fact, that's what CBD is FDA approved for. We have a little bit of information that CBD can have anti-addictive properties, in particular with individuals who have a dependency to opioids or have cravings for opioids. There's a little bit of clinical trial data that CBD can actually help with schizophrenics, actually reducing their symptoms and psychosis. And it seems to have a beneficial impact on anxiety, and in particular, social anxiety. And there's pretty much little to no human data on how CBD can be used to treat pain or to treat insomnia. And the reason and much more, right? And the reason I bring this up is you hear people anecdotally talk about all the benefits of CBD, but when you look at the actual rigorous clinical trial data, a vast majority of things that people talk about or that companies are selling products to or that consumers are using these products for aren't really grounded in clinical trial data. Now, when we look at the animal data on, actually, one thing I also want to mention on CBD, in terms of the side effects of CBD, CBD has a good safety profile, but there are still side effects. So some of the most common side effects include lethargy and digestive issues, sometimes diarrhea, things like that. And also there's a concern from the FDA that CBD might elevate your liver enzymes. It might be causing some sort of malfunction of the liver. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But we definitely need more data on that. That's some of the reasons why the FDA doesn't have a favorable position on CBD. Now, when looking at animal data on CBD, we see that it has analgesic properties. So again, in rat studies, anti-pain properties. Again, we haven't really fully studied that in humans. It has sleep modulating effects. And again, we don't really have clinical trial data on CBD for that. We know that CBD has antioxidant properties, has anti-inflammatory properties, actually anti-tumor effects, either slowing the growth of cancer, actively shrinking cancer, working synergistically with other chemotherapeutic agents to inhibit and kill cancer cells. And it's also a neuroprotectant, so preserving neuronal function and viability in light of stresses, whether it's ischemic stress, lack of oxygen, all the way to mouse models of dementia, of Alzheimer's. You actually see that you're able to prevent and mitigate those effects in mice who are otherwise predetermined to have Alzheimer's through genetic predisposition. So some pretty fascinating things in the animal data. Again, huge caveat, last time I checked, we're not rats. So we need more human clinical trials to really flesh these areas out. Now, turning our attention to the regulations. So for those of you who aren't familiar, in 2018, the USDA Farm Bill was passed. And within it, there was a provision that said, hey, we're gonna define this thing called hemp. And hemp is gonna be anything from the cannabis species that has less than 0.3% THC. And for comparison, cannabis sold in these state legal dispensaries, whether for adult use or medical purposes, you tend to see 10, 15, 20, 25, 30% THC. So we're talking, 1 to 2 orders of magnitude less THC in hemp. And the Farm Bill basically said hemp is now an agricultural product. It is not a controlled substance. So that's what opened the floodgates to both hemp cultivation, but also the explosion you see in CBD commerce. Prior to that, CBD was theoretically a controlled substance, so it was difficult to engage in commerce with it. Now, that same year, the FDA actually approved the first and only drug in America that contains CBD. It's called Epidiolex. It's approved for pediatric epilepsy, and it's basically pure CBD dissolved in sesame oil. Now, this had profound implications for the dietary supplement non-prescription usage of CBD. And that's when we get to this notion of the drug preclusion. And so the drug preclusion is this FDA regulation that says when it comes to things that can be sold as a dietary supplement, but also somehow end up being a prescription drug, depending on which came first, will impact how it can be sold. So if the pharmaceutical drug got to basically an investigational new drug status before that same compound was sold as a supplement, it can never be sold as a supplement. And their rationale for creating this regulation, it's not a new regulation, their rationale was, if a pharma company is going to invest a lot of time and money into bringing a product through the FDA, and that product maybe, say, is naturally occurring and could also be sold as a supplement, the pharma company needs assurances that if they were to put all this time and effort in, you're not just going to have 1,000 companies selling it as a supplement and writing the research, writing the validation that the pharma company generated. Now, if that same product was already being sold as a supplement, and then a pharma company took it through the FDA, both are allowed to be sold. So it depends on which came first. And so right now, the FDA's stance is that Epidiolex was an investigational drug well before 2014, and CBD wasn't really marketed or sold as a supplement any earlier than that. So the FDA will cite this drug preclusion rule as to why CBD can't be sold as a supplement. It is and forever will be a drug that requires FDA approval. So FDA has been sending lots of warning letters to brands and companies selling CBD. The warning letters are talking about that these are unapproved new drugs that can't be sold like this. The warning letters also have described, often these products are making disease claims, so the warning letters are often centered around that. The warning letters also will discuss some of the potential side effects that the FDA is concerned about. I mentioned some of that earlier, some of the side effects, but the main side effect that the FDA is concerned about is this issue of liver dysfunction. And almost all of that data or concern comes from the FDA trials of Epidiolex for pediatric epilepsy. And in those trials, those study participants were already quite sick. These are kids who are having dozens, maybe hundreds of seizures a day. They were already on a slew of other medications, anti-epileptic drugs, for example, that have a known impact, detrimental impact on the liver. And they were using doses of CBD that were extraordinarily high, sometimes in excess of 1,000 milligrams a day. And for reference, your average CBD product on the market maybe has a serving size of 25 milligrams of CBD. And so counter arguments against the FDA's concern is that the liver safety issue was brought about in a study population that looks nothing like the average American taking these products, and stemmed from a dosage of CBD that looks nothing like the dosages of CBD found in these commercial products. Another issue that the FDA is concerned about is the mislabeling of CBD products. They tested well over 100 products, and they found that less than half actually had CBD content that was within a certain margin of error to what was actually on the label. So for all these reasons, the FDA has had a very chilly attitude towards CBD. And right now, the regulations are kind of stuck in a quagmire. You have thousands of CBD brands out there. You have tens of millions of Americans using CBD. Some retailers carry CBD, some retailers won't. The FDA continues to say that these shouldn't be sold, these can't be sold. Enforcement hasn't been very strict. And so it's unfortunately, it's a quagmire to say the least. Okay, now shifting gears a little bit, I'm going to talk about a study called ACES, and it stands for Advancing CBD Education in Science. And it was a study that was recently completed, and it was the largest CBD clinical trial ever done in history and involved several thousand individuals. And it was actually run by my company, Radicle Science. So I'll talk a bit more about how we ran the study. We'll go through some of the results and some of the interesting findings and how they might add to the scientific literature. So the first thing is the ACES research team was actually a collaboration between my company, Radicle Science, many of our scientists, as well as collaborators from various universities and researchers in general. So it was a whole team effort, and we're currently working on the manuscript, which we will be submitting for peer review publication within the next, month or so. And so this is what was really nice is a lot of what we tried to do with ACES wasn't really possible at the university level. And by that, I mean, had I tried to run the same study while I was running UCLA's cannabis research program, it wouldn't have worked for several reasons that we can talk about. So it was nice that we were able to do it independent of the universities, but still get input from various faculty and individuals that are affiliated with universities. So what was really interesting about the way we ran the study, it was completely virtual. So we didn't involve clinical trial sites. There were no clinical assessments. It involved participants from all 50 states, a significant amount of which lived in rural communities, which are traditionally excluded from clinical trials. So the studies were conducted virtually. The products arrived direct to consumer. They were just shipped in the mail. Consumers participated and gave data directly to us via their email and mobile devices. And we recruited people virtually too. Whereas in a typical trial, you have, say, a hospital involved. They slowly recruit through the patients that come through the hospital. Once they're recruited into the study, they go to the hospital to get the product. They go to the hospital to give data, et cetera. All these things that dramatically increase the cost, the time, the complexity, as well as the burden on the participants. And that's why you often see lots of communities underrepresented in physical trials. This is also a very large-scale study. Again, we had 3,000 people involved. The next largest CBD study prior to this maybe had a few hundred people, so it was an order of magnitude larger. And really building in that intentional heterogeneity in the study population. Again, geography, demographics, et cetera, whereas clinical trials often result in very homogeneous study populations. And also, we kept the inclusion-exclusion criteria very broad to be able to have a large, diverse study population come in. As far as the study design goes, the study ran for 4 weeks. So individuals received product, they used it for 4 weeks, and we collected health outcome data for 4 weeks. It was an open label study, which means the participants knew which of the 13 products they had received, and we got IRB approval for the study as well. So the way this worked is people in the study were randomized to one of 13 products, or they were put on a waitlist control. And the waitlist control meant that they were going to receive product, but they weren't going to get it till the study ended. So while they were in the study, they weren't taking any product, but we were still tracking their health outcomes. And what is nice about that control is it allows us to do two things. It allows us, one, to observe what's the natural resolution of someone that has symptoms of pain or sleep or anxiety. So we know the natural course without any treatment. And that control group also lets us account for macro factors. So for instance, if you were in Eastern Europe right now with a war going on, everyone's anxiety might go through the roof. Everyone might have disturbed sleep. And so by looking at the control group, we can kind of understand and control for macro conditions that might be impacting the health outcomes we observe. So nearly 3,000 participants were recruited. To be eligible, you had to have reporting symptoms of anxiety, a sleep issue, or chronic pain. And they were randomized to receive one of 13 products or to be in the waitlist control. And the main objectives we were looking at were actually well-being, which is a very holistic, encompassing measure. And the secondary objectives we were looking at were change in pain, sleep disturbance, and anxiety compared to the control group. The health outcome measures we looked at were all using validated outcome measures. What's nice about these, you're not simply just saying, on a scale of 1 to 5, how do you feel? These are measures that have been tested in countless prior trials. They've been demonstrated to accurately track these conditions. They've been demonstrated to be sensitive to change. They've been demonstrated to have external validity as well. And also with these measures, they allow us to benchmark to the prior literature. So we know, for instance, on the promised sleep disturbance scale, when that score changes X amount, we know, is that a meaningful change or is that maybe just noise? Because these measures have been validated in so many prior clinical trials. We know what's meaningful changes in these measures. And we also looked at side effects as well. Looking at the study products, if you Google ACES, you can see the 13 brands who were involved. I didn't list them here, but you can see that we had a wide diversity of product attributes, and that was a goal of ACES as well. So we had capsules and tablets and tinctures and soft gels and gummies and oral sprays. They had different dosages, different spectrum as well. Full spectrum, meaning that it is a relatively unprocessed extract of hemp and contains some legal limit of THC. Then you have broad spectrum, which typically refers to a full spectrum product where the THC has been removed to have effectively zero THC, as opposed to full spectrum, which has a little THC. And then you often will hear isolate. Isolate just means pure CBD. So, broad spectrum and full spectrum might have other cannabinoids in tiny amounts. They might have other phytocompounds from the hemp plant in tiny amounts, whereas isolate's just pure CBD. So again, we had broad, isolate, and full spectrum products as well. And the CBD dosage per serving ranged from single digits all the way to 50 to 100 milligrams a serving. So again, we had people participating from all 50 states, although most of the participants came from California, Texas, and Florida, which is not surprising. Those are the 3 largest states in our country. One interesting thing is, females have traditionally been underrepresented in clinical trials. In fact, there was a very long period of time where females were not allowed to be in clinical trials. And so when we went to recruit, we specifically made sure to recruit heavily through channels that we know would reach a lot of women. And in some ways we succeeded, but in other ways we overshot having a equal gender ratio. So we were aiming to have equal female-male participation. We ended up having, over 90% of the participants being female. Now, if you look at the demographics of CBD users and the demographics of people who purchase supplements for the household, it skews female, but we weren't expecting this. And since then, we've corrected our recruitment measures. So our studies are all now roughly even male and female ratios. In terms of their experience with CBD, about a third had never tried it, and nearly 2/3 had only tried it a few times. But we did exclude anyone who reported active, current, regular use of CBD. Now, looking at some of the outcome measures. So this first graph on your left is looking at the change in their well-being score. The blue line are the 13 different products that people could have been randomized to. The yellow line is the control group. So again, you look at the control group and it looks like well-being stays about the same throughout the course of the 4 weeks. Whereas in the product group, you had significant improvements in their well-being score. When it came to their anxiety score, again, you saw that the control group had about the same, maybe a slight decline in their anxiety over the 4 weeks without any treatment, whereas the product groups had significant declines in their anxiety. And notice that that big inflection point happens usually within the first week, and then it continues to improve, but at a lighter slope. So we did see that consistently across all these symptoms, was that the most improvements were seen in the first week, then you had a little more gradual improvements all the way to the end of the study. Some of the things you can see for sleep disturbance, the control group improved a little bit on their own. You had significant improvements in the product group. Same thing goes for pain on the right-hand side as well. So those were kind of the high-level visuals via charts, but diving into the actual results, like we said, we saw the largest improvements were observed in the first week of the product. When it came to well-being, there was on average, a 71% improvement that the product groups experienced. When it came to anxiety, 63% of participants experienced a clinically meaningful improvement. Again, that's the beauty of using these validated outcome measures. We know what a change in these outcome measures represents. Was it, again, a minor difference, or was it clinically meaningful? Clinically meaningful being that it is a palpable and distinct improvement to their symptoms and to their quality of life. And when it came to sleep, a slightly smaller number, 61% of the people who received products as opposed to the control group experienced a clinically meaningful improvement. And then pain, you had a lower a percentage of people who experienced an improvement, but it was still 47% had a clinically meaningful improvement. So you're seeing, half to well over half of individuals who received a CBD product actually experiencing clinically meaningful improvement within 4 weeks, and large improvements within the first week. So what this is telling you is that the folks who are walking into a store and buying a CBD product, most of them, for these symptoms, are experiencing a significant improvement in the symptoms and their quality of life. And that's probably why no surprise that despite the FDA's warnings, despite major retailers not carrying CBD, you have tens of millions of Americans who are using CBD. And I believe up to a third, if not more, of all Americans have tried CBD at some point. Now, we looked at the data a different way, and we were trying to figure out, was there any characteristic about an individual that would predict their likelihood of experiencing a positive outcome? And we didn't find any. So we looked at the data set separating males and females. We looked at the data set separating the naive versus experienced users. We looked at the data set separating different age groups, and we could find no differences. None of these were predictors of a likelihood of positive response to CBD. Now, when it came to side effects, there was, on average, about 10% of participants who received one of the products reported some side effects. And if you look at this chart, the most common side effects were generally related to digestive issues. There was also some headache being a common one, but out of the top 4 issues, 3 were related to digestive issues, gas, diarrhea, bloating. A lot of these products did contain oil as the carrier, so sometimes oil can also upset the digestive tract as well. It could also have been due to the CBD. But generally, you can see that side effects were relatively uncommon and generally mild. And again, when it came to the FDA's warnings on CBD, the other side effects that have been reported in the literature have also been, gastrointestinal issues. It's been a major one. But again, when it comes back to the FDA, they are concerned about liver safety. Liver safety, liver safety, liver safety. That's their biggest concern from a safety standpoint. Again, owing to what we saw in those clinical trials of those pediatric epilepsy patients using ultra-high doses of CBD. And some other areas that we weren't really assessing in our study and that no one really knows the answer to is the impact of CBD on the reproductive system. So there is a theoretical impact on, say, some of the other FDA's concerns are it might impact the male reproductive system, potentially lowering rates of fertility, and it's still unknown what the impact of CBD is on, say, a developing fetus. So generally, the caution here is for CBD is if you have liver disease, or if anyone's ever told you you have an issue with your liver, or you, say, drink a lot of alcohol, or you're taking other drugs that also can pose a risk to your liver, probably stay away from CBD. And if you're trying to get pregnant, probably stay away from CBD, whether you're male or female. And furthermore, CBD does have potential interactions with other drugs. And so another word of caution that I typically give is if you're taking a prescription medication that carries a grapefruit warning, says don't eat grapefruits or drink grapefruit juice when on this medication, you should probably also avoid CBD. And that's because CBD and grapefruits interact with similar drugs. And they can basically, depending on which drug it is, it can either boost levels of that drug in your body or reduce levels of that drug in your body. So if the drug at higher levels has a toxic effect by boosting levels of that drug in your body, that's not good. Also, if it lowers levels of that drug in your body, but you need a certain level for a therapeutic effect, it can diminish the therapeutic effect as well. So again, if you take drugs that carry a grapefruit warning, you should probably also avoid CBD. All right, just to wrap up some of the kind of key findings from the ACES study. So taking any of the 13 CBD products led to significant improvements across all of the health outcomes, well-being, sleep, pain, anxiety, relative to the waitlist control. Side effects were pretty rare and generally mild. And when we looked at characteristics of participants, be it sex, age, prior CBD use, we could not find any predictors, any of those characteristics being predictive of a positive experience or outcome. When we looked at CBD spectrum, so when we clustered the 13 products by broad, by full, or by isolate as their spectrum, we didn't see significant differences in their health outcomes. And to our knowledge, this is one of the first, if not the first, trials to actually try to compare CBD products by spectrum. There is a theory and a belief that is discussed widely in the cannabis space of the so-called entourage effect, where the whole constellation of phytocompounds from the cannabis plant, the terpenes, the cannabinoids, and in particular THC, generate an effect that is superior to any of the compounds by itself. And proponents of this theory will point to the fact that, say, Marinol, synthetic pure THC, FDA approved since 1986. Doctors don't prescribe it much. Patients don't use it much. They all gravitate towards cannabis. Even though Marinol is FDA approved, it's legal for usage, it's pure, it's quality assured, your insurance might cover it, yet people don't really use it. Why is that? Maybe pure THC acts very differently than cannabis, which again has well over 100 different phyto compounds that have physiologic effects. So this is an area that definitely needs further exploration. Now, when we looked at CBD per serving in our study, paradoxically, we found that lower doses of CBD per serving, not always, but often outperformed higher doses for things like well-being, anxiety, and pain. When it came to sleep, we didn't see any dose per serving having a predictive effect on sleep outcomes. But for well-being, anxiety, and pain, not always, but sometimes the lower doses were actually outperforming the higher doses. And dosing is a huge black box question mark for CBD. No one really knows. There's been so few clinical trials exploring such a narrow dose range for a narrow set of conditions. Like earlier I mentioned, it was schizophrenia, addiction, epilepsy. So no one really knows what dose is appropriate for pain or anxiety or insomnia, especially when you're talking about a full or broad spectrum product, which might be principally different than a pure CBD product. That's often what was studied. Not often, it's pretty much what was studied, period, in these prior clinical trials, which is pure pharmaceutical CBD. All right, wrapping up with some caveats here. So this was an open label study, which means the participants knew that they got CBD. It was not a placebo-controlled blinded study. And the goal here was not actually to disentangle the placebo effect. The goal here was to capture in a diverse population and using as much real-world data approach as possible, what is happening to these tens of millions of consumers that are purchasing CBD every day. That's what this study was designed to mimic. Because when you purchase this stuff, you know what's in it, you're using it in the comfort of your own home, and you're using it according to how you think. Sure, there's a recommended serving size, but you end up, using it how you decide to use it. There was that female gender skew. Again, over 90% of people in the study were female. Perhaps that has implications on the impact on the data. And it's hard to draw firm conclusions between products based on any single characteristic. And that's because the products did not just differ from one another by one characteristic. Often they were differing by multiple characteristics. So they were different in serving size and form factor, or different in form factor and formulation. Formulation being, was it broad, was it full, was it isolate, etc. So by no means is this study conclusive as to what are attributes of products that make them more or less likely to have positive health outcomes, and as well as, what are attributes of people that make them more or less likely to have a positive outcome from something like CBD. And, I'm not sure who this quote's attributed to, but I always like to bring it up that every great study warrants another 4 studies. So this is the first of many studies that we're doing on this topic, and we hope that this also inspires more research around the world. Now, if you tried to do a 3,000-person, 13-arm open-label trial on CBD in a university setting, this probably would never happen, or it would take 5 years or longer and cost millions of millions of millions of millions. And so that's why there's other reasons as well why CBD isn't more readily studied in universities, but clearly cost, time, and complexity is one major factor. Another major factor is the fact that because the FDA says CBD is a drug, not a supplement, and universities take federal funding, universities pretty much can only study CBD under an investigational new drug framework. And IND and clinical trials under IND guidelines versus clinical trials under, say, supplement guidelines have dramatically higher costs and complexity. And even the manufacturers of the products have to come under a lot more scrutiny and regulatory hurdles. So that's probably one of the main reasons why there isn't more CBD research coming out of university settings, say in America, because all these things have to proceed under this very slow and expensive IND, investigational new drug research framework. And it's not the university's fault. They take federal funding. And when you take federal funding, you have to follow these federal guidelines very strictly. All right, so in conclusion, what we're saying from the study is that, comparable populations, and what's nice again is we had a pretty diverse mix of individuals, that comparable populations taking similar CBD products can experience significant improvements in their well-being, their anxiety, their sleep quality, and their pain in just under 4 weeks. And often with the improvements, dramatic improvements happening even in the first week. The findings from the study also suggest what we've known already from other studies, that CBD generally has a favorable safety profile. Participants reported few adverse events, and they were generally mild. Most common ones being gastrointestinal related. And the last thing is, looking at the products in our studies, it appears that the health outcomes and the effects might be contingent upon the amount of CBD per serving, and paradoxically, more CBD per serving is not necessarily better. And whereas when we looked at, for example, the spectrum, broad, isolate, and full, we didn't necessarily find any significant difference when we grouped products that way. Now, on the CBD serving side, there's some interesting animal studies and a handful of human studies that have also shown that more CBD is not necessarily better, that there is a moderate dose of CBD that has better effects than either a high dose or a low dose. And so this has been demonstrated again in both mostly animal studies, but there's also a handful of human studies that have played with different doses and found that the optimal effectiveness actually came from an intermediate, or not intermediate dose from in an absolute term, but came from a dose that was in the middle of several doses that they were exploring. So with that, we will open it up to questions.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Chen, for your informative presentation. And we will now start the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please do so now. Just click on the Ask a Question box located on the far left of your screen. So let's get started. Our first question is, how and when do you think regulation on CBD will change?
So there have been several attempts in Congress to actually pass a law that would make CBD a dietary supplement and would subject it to the same regulations as all dietary supplements. And so these proposed bills in the past have gotten bipartisan support. In fact, the push for hemp legalization was actually driven predominantly by Republican politicians who had a lot of agricultural constituents who wanted a new cash crop that wasn't tobacco, that wasn't corn. And hemp is much more valuable as a cash crop if you can actually use the cannabinoids from it. If you just grow it for fiber or seed, it's worth a tiny fraction than if you can grow it for cannabinoids. So I think there is bipartisan support as well for regulation that will clarify and make CBD a supplement, because the retailers want it, consumers want it, and even the farmers want it as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's going to be a congressional act that's going to add clarity and full legality to the use of CBD as a supplement. I don't think it's going to be the FDA suddenly changing its stance. And as for when it'll happen, there's a saying that's like, never predict the future if you don't want to be wrong. So as for when it'll happen, who knows, man. I think they were trying to get another bill introduced this year, but it sounds like there's just some other more pressing concerns right now in Congress. So it might still be years before we get any clarity on the issue.
Right, thank you for that. Another question we have is, what are the CBD dosages that were associated with greater chances for achieving clinically meaningful reductions in symptoms?
Right. So, and I need to go back and take a look at the data set. But if you see, let's see if I can jump to it. So if you look at, it was actually the doses below 15 milligrams that were often outperforming the higher doses. And again, the dose is not the end-all be-all, because these products differed in other attributes as well. Now, if all the products were the same, they were all full-spectrum gummies that just differed in dose, then you could say, oh, interesting, like here's what the dose showed. But in this case, the products differed in a lot of areas. But as far as we can tell, when we just looked at dose, setting aside the other attributes, we found that products with less than 15 milligrams per serving were often outperforming the products at higher ones. And we had products in the study that had servings of over 25 milligrams, over 50, all the way approaching 100. But again, this is just on average, and it wasn't all the time that the lower doses outperformed the higher doses. Now, what's interesting is if you look at the clinical trials that have been done on CBD, showing benefits for epilepsy, schizophrenia, addiction, and social anxiety, for example, they were testing doses hundreds of milligrams a day, all the way up to 1,000 or in excess of 1,000 milligrams a day. the published literature, blinded randomized controlled clinical trials on CBD has so rarely studied less than, 200 milligrams and has pretty much not studied 20, 30, 5, 10, all these other values. So there is a big gap in the literature. But again, looking at some of the animal studies and some of the human studies, there's this notion that, hey, more CBD might not necessarily be better. And it's not just CBD. This is not an uncommon phenomenon in pharmacology, where in the dosage window, there sometimes is a moderate dose that's actually most optimal.
Thank you for that. And our next question is, what evidence is there for so-called entourage effect?
Right. So it primarily comes from animal studies, where they would give the mice, say, pure CBD versus a hemp or cannabis extract that had a same amount of CBD, so the dose was the same, but that extract had all the other stuff in the plant, other terpenes, other cannabinoids, other phytocompounds. And they found pretty distinct differences in their effects and outcomes. So a few studies that come to mind, they looked at inflammation in rats, and they found that even when matched for the same dose of CBD, the full spectrum, the plant extract, significantly outperformed a same dose of CBD when it was just CBD by itself, had much better anti-inflammatory effect. Also, when looking at studies in cancer cell lines, again, not even animal, but like a petri dish study, so huge caveat, but they would take, for instance, pure THC and expose the cells in the tumor cells in the petri dish to the pure THC, and then they would expose the tumor cells to a cannabis extract that had the same amount of THC, but again, had a bunch of other stuff in it. And the cannabis extract had significantly better anti-cancer activity. The pure THC was able to kill a certain percentage of the cancer cells, but the cannabis extract was able to kill significantly more. And so the real question for this so-called entourage effect, first off, is it present in humans? And also, there's so many different types of cannabis and they're grown so differently. Even if this turns out to be true, it's not going to be true all the time, if that makes any sense, because every extract of cannabis is a completely different assortment of dozens, if not hundreds, of physically active compounds. And so there's been some work by Dedi Marie out of Israel, where he took a cannabis extract and then sequentially purified it more and more and more. And each time he did a round of purification, he would expose, in this case, again, it was cancer cells. He'd expose cancer cells to a extract that was getting increasingly purified until he found that the effects started to change. Then he would know, oh, well, these were the 5 compounds that were purified out and the effects changed. Maybe one of those 5 was a key constituent. So a big question for the entourage effect is, do you need hundreds? Do you need dozens? Is it like 3 key compounds in the cannabis plant that will effectively create the effect that the whole extract will create? And if you look at Dedi's work, at least when it comes to cancer cell lines, it looks like the answer is somewhere between like 2 and 8. 2 to 8 ingredients are critical and can effectively approximate the entire plant extract. But again, human studies are still pretty lacking right now, aside from this anecdotal observation that pure THC has been FDA approved for almost 40 years, yet no one really uses it. Everyone gravitates towards medical cannabis, both physicians and patients. So
thank you for that response. And then we can try to wrap up with this last question. I don't know if there'll be a set answer, but somebody was curious if there was a reason the study duration wasn't a little bit longer.
Sure. Yeah, so part of the reason for the study duration was just the speed with which we wanted to launch and complete the study and get data out there. When we launched the study, our company was only a few months old. So we launched the study last summer, and it was done before Christmas. So, pretty unprecedented. This is a study that should have taken, whatever, 5 years, and we got it done in 6 months. So part of that was we kept the study duration short so that we could actually finish the study quicker and get the results back to the brands in the study and get the results back to society faster. Furthermore, we had a suspicion that based on some prior preliminary studies we've done, that the effects would happen in the first couple weeks and then would kind of plateau off. So we could have done a longer study. I don't think there would have been that much of a difference between, say, day 30 and day 60. Like, I don't think their pain would have gotten that much better or worse beyond how it had already changed in the first 30 days. But certainly there is a role for longer term studies, and what the FDA is asking for is longer term studies where they specifically get to track liver function. But again, a long-term study on a lot of people tracking liver function, it's super, super expensive. Right now, no one's really stepped up to pay for that, especially if that would be a study done on non-prescription products that you can't really patent and monopolize the same way that you can with a pharma product. So that's why there's a lot more safety data on Epidiolex, right, the FDA-approved CBD product, than these commercial products, because there really isn't. These companies don't have the budgets to pay for multi-million-dollar long-term safety studies. Unfortunately, it's not their fault. It's just that type of research is really expensive.
That makes sense. Thank you for your insight. Thank you overall, Dr. Chen, for your informative presentation, for your time today and your important research. And before we go, I'd like to thank the audience for joining us today and for their interesting questions. Questions we did not have time for today and those submitting during the on-demand period will be addressed by the speaker via the contact information you provided at the time of registration. This webcast can be viewed on demand for 2 years until March 23rd, 2024, and LabRoots will alert you via email when it's available for replay. We encourage you to share that email with any colleagues who may have missed today's live event. Thank you again. Until next time, goodbye.
Thanks for having me. Bye.